Sayus kamratski, or should I say, welcome my friends and coworkers. My name is Gabriel Lindgren, and today you are looking at a presentation about one of the most interesting subjects from my point of view. The subject I have chosen got the title Vladimir Putin and the Corruption of Russia. How one single man managed to drive a country to total corruption. Of course I beg for apology if someone feels offended by that title, but the title is the truth, and the truth that I will stand for today. So without further ado, let's dive into a world of bribing, crimes and stealing. A world ruled like an Italian mafia or some sort of bizarre American movie. Let's talk about Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin was born on the 7th of October 1952. Putin's father, Vladimir, was a fall-disabled war veteran, and his mother was a hard-working communistic example of a woman. Putin was brought to a world in Leningrad full of poverty, misery and crimes. On the streets of a ruined city, Putin mobilized small, almost gangster-like groups of kids to terrorize certain people. Putin as a boy has been described in several not-so-flattering ways. For example, he was so full of revenge that if someone started to pick on him, he would simply put down his things and jump on the poor fellow. So as you might imagine, Putin's childhood wasn't really a good choice of raising a small middle-class Soviet boy in. But to add to the story, Putin's childhood was actually one of the most important parts of his life. Because this was actually the first time that Putin started to create the image which he would sustain for the rest of his life. The portrait of a young gangster boy that went from bad to good and made life worth to live. Putin also started to separate himself from other people during his early teens. And it's not very many that can describe Putin from his teens, because he didn't want to have any new friends. It was a sort of way for him telling others that they were less worth than he was. And it was this thing that could make the time Putin needed to create his character. During the time of Putin's teen, he only dreamed about one thing: to join the security police KGB. KGB was at the time of Putin's teens one of the biggest institutes in all of Russia, and was not only notorious in the Western countries but also in Russia. With a number of 500,000 hired agents and officers, the institute was the biggest source of spying, infiltration and bribery in both Soviet and the Western countries. Some of the most feared people during the Cold War was often KGB agents, and the process that the officer did when they followed people was called the Stalin method. It was to these units that the young Putin dreamed of joining one day. A dream which would change his life forever. But a problem still remained. KGB wouldn't just hire any middle-class ordinary boy from Leningrad. The thing that KGB searched for was a strong person with even stronger personality. People that could work hard for little in pay, but with something else. More of loyalty to the institute and even more loyalty to the motherland. So Putin searched his way instead to the University of Leningrad, the finest university in all of Soviet. A university that no one thought would welcome the boy that was raised in the one-room apartment. He chose something that he never thought he would enjoy studying as a teen: international court and the German language. When Putin was halfway through his course, he met a man who would change the rest of his adult career. Anatoly Sobchak was at the time of Putin's studies a professor in law and court, and was one of Putin's best friends during the whole university time. A person which would influence Putin extremely much throughout his life. But we will come back to that later. Putin started during the university time to save money to complete his own vanity with more material items. He visited his parents and prepared himself for a thing he had longed for in all of his life: In 1975, Vladimir Putin quit the university and instead joined the secret police KGB, a choice of career that would remain for him for 15 years. So already in his young adult life, Putin threw himself into a world of spy. As an example of Putin's career, I have chosen a picture which I now show in the bottom of these three pictures. In the picture you can see President Ronald Reagan shake hands with a little Russian boy at a meeting in Soviet, probably in the late 80s. Behind the little boy you can see a blonde man with a camera around his neck. This man actually is now proven to be Vladimir Putin. And during this time, Vladimir Putin was an active KGB agent. So the only reasonable explanation to this photo is that Vladimir Putin was actually spying on the United States president. And that is a revealment that has been very interesting to people not liking Putin, if I may say so. So that is an interesting fact, of course. A warm summer's day in 1989, Vladimir Putin returned to his homeland after almost a decade in the fallen East Germany as a spy. Poor, depressed and slightly fat, Putin first, according to his wife, saw himself as a traitor against Soviet. But the more he talked about how he felt, the more of his old confidence he regained. And he regained it even stronger than before. So, to finally achieve something in his life, Putin called his old friend Anatoly Sobchak, a teacher from the university, a man that by this time had advanced from professor to the mayor of Leningrad. So Putin asked Sobchak to help him get a job, since he knew that Sobchak had good contacts within his work. Sobchak really liked the young radical Putin that in his mind had the right spirit. He also realized Putin's working capacity. Putin also quit working at the KGB in this time, but still had his license registered for a few years. So Putin started to work for the mayor at the Department of International Relations. But things would change for Putin's quiet job. In 1992, the Soviet Union dissolved, and a man named Boris Yeltsin desperately took over the power in Russia as the first democratic elected president. But a thing that Yeltsin still hadn't sorted out was who would take over as the chief of the presidential staff. So Yeltsin asked his old friend Sobchak if he could recommend someone for him. Of course, Sobchak could only think of one person, and it directly recommended Vladimir Putin as a man for the job. And so Vladimir Putin started working for the president of Russia, and his real political career was finally at the beginning. But Putin didn't though find any joy in the things he did for the president, and missed the time as an officer in KGB. Boris Yeltsin therefore gave Putin the job as chief over FSB. FSB was the dissolvent product of KGB, and often acted as KGB would have acted if it still would have existed. Putin ruled the freshly created institute with an iron hand, quite similar to the way he today rules Russia. So in 1998, 1 year before his retirement, Boris Yeltsin still hadn't picked a prime minister to succeed him in the election. The man needed to drive Russia out of the inflation that occurred during Boris Yeltsin's last years, and a man that really could identify himself with the Russian people. If Vladimir Putin would have been picked for the post as the Prime Minister of Russia, I would probably not sit here and talk about this. So Vladimir Putin's almost magical quest kept on going, and of course his greed had no limits at the time. He wanted to go for the top, the presidential post. The election in 1999 went fine for Putin, who at the time had sympathy with the majority of the Russians. Putin, during the time of the election, astonished over his own prestation from the beginning of KGB to the presidential run. A great achievement, yes, but was it good for anyone else than Putin himself? You may want to ask yourself that question. As most of you probably know, Putin won the election in 1999. and in the beginning of 2000, Putin was sworn in as the new president of Russia. And one of the first things that Putin did as a president that has affected many writers and journalists was to hire a crew to write his life biography. The biography was not at all a goodwill thing from Putin's side. It was instead a way so that Putin could write his own life story and choose how he wanted people to look at him. Because at the time, no one really knew anything about Vladimir Putin. He was just a politician that had risen from nothing to everything. So Putin continued the character process and image building that he had started as a teen. But the best thing for a journalist by the biography was the fact that the writers leaked about Putin's thoughts and reactions to some very sensitive questions. Wonder what they were. Thank you for listening at this small history presentation, and yes, thank you. We will probably meet again, and you're probably invited to the real presentation that I will hold in school. So see you back then. Have a great time. Thank you.